So thank you for that introduction. And as my colleagues have shown, it is a little difficult to give pastors just 10 minutes. So I'm going to do my best to walk us through women in the movement in the United States and how that relates to public theology. Because of that, I'll use kind of some shorthand. As we know, John Wesley himself, if we can go to the first slide, John Wesley himself had an understanding that women were indeed called to ministry in various capacities. While he felt short of ordination for women, he did believe that they brought a contribution to the Methodist movement in Great Britain, and he celebrated their ministry among the people. In fact, in his sermon on visiting the sick, if we go to the next slide, he was able to say that they were a call to the rest of us to go and to visit the sick, to be involved in our communities. He defended their ministries to others who questioned it. And he tried to say, how many among you would do as they have done? And so, with this backing, the women in the United States actually came up to this understanding of what it means to be in ministry. And if you know anything about the United States during the colonial period and just after the American Revolution, we had a revival period with camp meetings. And those camp meetings or revival meetings actually had women preaching. If we go to the next slide. And in that, 22 women were known to preach in those during that time period, and they were renowned for their ability to bring the gospel into those communities where they were preaching. And because of that, many of them were invited into pulpits. And it's kind of a mixed response to the women who offered themselves to the preaching role. Some of them went to congregations that they had been invited to preach among and found the doors locked to them, or were met at the door with pitchforks and other violent means of running them off of the property. And so they were barred from the very pulpits that they had been invited to preach in. And because of that, we find in the next slide that researchers look to what it means to be a female in ministry in the United States today. And we look all the way back to this past to really talk about this is a complicated history. We have many women that were brought up in the Methodist tradition, taught that they were given these gifts by God and blessed by the Holy Spirit to preach. And yet you have this push and pull, whether they are welcome in pulpits or not. But for us, we have the blessing of knowing that women who were called continued to offer their gifts to the church and beyond the church. And because these women were put in positions within the Methodist tradition to develop their leadership skills, as we look at the history of Methodist women in the United States, many of them were involved in public theology in powerful ways. And that includes abolition of slavery and using their voices to push back against the practice of enslavement in the United States. That was also using their voice to develop anti-lynching legislation that passed Congress, and it was to fight and advocate for their own rights as suffragettes and in the temperance movement. And so we have this wonderful tapestry of history of these women from the Methodist movement being cultivated and taught that their voices were important. And because of their ability to step into leadership roles within the church, they were able to step into leadership roles in the larger culture. I'm just going to highlight a few. And so we're going to start with Anna Howard Shaw. Anna Howard Shaw was active in her community. If we go to the next slide, she is one who um, would go out. She would go out and preach to Thank you very much. She would go out and preach to her trees as a child. And because of her ability to rally groups of people, she felt a call to ministry. And that call was actually confirmed by others. And eventually, Anna Howard Shaw became the first woman to receive a license to preach in the Methodist Episcopal Church. But beyond that, she was very involved in the temperance movement and in the suffragettes movement, and she started many organizations that gave voices to women in powerful ways. Back to the earlier presentation, she was anti-war, and she stood by those principles and resigned a lot of those positions when the U.S. went to war. And so she is a powerful and prominent figure in our history of this blending of public theology, but based out of her ability to speak in the church. Now we'll move to Frances Willard. Thank you so much. Frances is also a woman that cultivated her gifts within the Methodist Episcopal Church. She was one that went out into the world and brought women to know that the suffering they faced in their own lives was not suffering that God wanted for them, that God had ordained for them. And so she brought women into the movement that could learn to advocate for themselves. And you can see in this quote that I pulled from her book about riding bicycles and how riding bicycles empowers women, that she is grounded in the Wesleyan tradition. You see echoes of his understanding of knowledge and love in her quote of an ounce of practice is worth a ton of theory. And so you can see how Frances used that background, as well as we're going to talk about Sojourner Truth. If we go to that slide, Sojourner Truth is a powerful figure in American history. She has the famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" And she is grounded in the church, and her work to advocate for formerly enslaved people to have power and access to power in the United States, as well as women to have power in the United States, is one that many people still lift up as a prime example of how we do public theology well. She was also a well-respected preacher and invited into many pulpits, mostly in the northern part of the United States. And because of her powerful preaching abilities, she did transform lives and communities through her examples, even as she still, of course, faced resistance for what she was preaching and how she was engaging in the world. It is not just famous women, though, that were brought up in this powerful tradition of public theology. And as we move to the next slide, we're going to talk about some women whose names have been lost to history. And this is the women of Passaic, New Jersey. These women actually were working in mills, and they were distressed at the horrific treatment of workers and how dangerous it was to work in these mills. And as you can see here, a reporter from that day watched the mill strikes and the rallies that happened around those strikes and pointed to the women leading those rallies and said, "This looks just like a Methodist revival meeting." And so you can see how these women, even though their names are lost in history, have used their background in the Methodist Episcopal Church to change their community. And that strike was successful and became a model that was replicated around the United States during this time as laborers advocated for their own rights and fought against child labor in the United States. Moving to the next slide, one of the most important things that these early women did is they realized that this movement had to be passed on to younger women, to the next generations. And so they sought to develop curriculum that could be used in churches. They sought to call other women into these opportunities to ensure that the women that came behind them were equipped to use their voices both in the church and in the larger society as they advocated for themselves. We can see echoes of their work still, if we go to the next slide, in both the movements in the United States through the Global Board of Church and Society and their advocacy for women and children. in legislation here in the United States. And you can also see it, as we go to the next slide, in the work of the United Women of Faith, the formerly United Methodist Women, and how they continue to call women together for advocacy days to use their voices to advocate for our future. I bring this to you, if we go to the last slide, because I realize that I'm coming to the end of my time, that I continue in this tradition to try to seek ways to involve women in the theological conversations of public theology in the states today. As you all might know, we had a rather interesting election recently. And as a result of that, I've been doing a lot of work trying to advocate for women's voices to continue to be heard, and have gathered women, laity and clergy alike, to continue to use that understanding of bringing these values to the next generation in the work we're doing here in the United States. And so the conversation continues. And I look forward to seeing the ways that we will learn from our forebears of faith and infuse our own understanding of faith and politics as we cultivate enthusiasm in this next generation of women, seeing the challenges that we face in the United States.